กับเรียนท่านผู้มีเกียรติทุกท่านครับขอต้อนรับเข้าสู่ช่วงบ่ายของ Educa 2011 ในวันแรกในวันนี้นะครับซึ่งในช่วงบ่ายนี้เราก็จะเข้าสู่การบรรยายของผู้นำทางการศึกษาระดับโลกอีกท่านหนึ่งนะครับในธีมที่3ธีมนี้เป็นเรื่องของการปฏิรูปความคิดจิตใจและปัญญานะครับในหัวข้อทฤษฎีพหุปัญญาและทฤษฎีจิต5ประการเพื่อความสำเร็จในยุคโลกาภิวัตน์นะครับโดยศาสตราจารย์ดร.ฮาวเวิร์ด การ์ดเนอร์นะครับซึ่งจะเป็นเทปวิดีทัศน์มานำเสนอท่านผู้มีเกียรตินะครับ For this afternoon we shall start with a state-of-the-art lecture on the third theme, mind and intelligence reform under the topic of multiple intelligences and 5 minds for the future, multiple intelligences and teacher education by Professor Dr. Howard Gardner, the founder of multiple intelligences theory from Graduate School of Education, Harvard University, USA.Howard Gardner is the John H. and Elizabeth A. Hobbs Professor of Cognition and Education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. He also holds positions as Adjunct Professor of Psychology at Harvard University and Senior Director of Harvard Project Zero. Among numerous honors, Professor Gardner received a MacArthur Prize Fellowship in 1981. He has received honorary degrees from 26 colleges and universities, including institutions in Bulgaria, Chile, Greece, Ireland, Israel, Italy, and South Korea. In 2005 and again in 2008, he was selected by Foreign Policy and Prospect magazines as one of the 100 most influential public intellectuals in the world.The author of 25 books translated into 28 languages and several hundred articles, Professor Gardner is best known in educational circles for his theory of multiple intelligences, a critique of the notion that there exists but a single human intelligence that can be adequately assessed by standard psychometric instruments. During the past 2 decades, Professor Gardner has been involved in the design of performance-based assessments, education for understanding, the use of multiple intelligences to achieve more personalized curriculum, instruction, and pedagogy, and the quality of interdisciplinary efforts in education. He has also written extensively on creativity, leadership, and professional ethics. So let's hear from him, Professor Dr. Gardner, Howard Gardner, on the topic of multiple intelligences and 5 minds for the future.
I'm Howard Gardner, and I'm happy to be speaking with you today from the library at Harvard University in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I'm going to be speaking about 2 subjects today. One is something I've been working on for many, many years. It's the theory of multiple intelligences. The other is much more recent work on the kind of minds that we need to develop in the future. In addition to having 2 topics, I'm also going to be wearing 2 hats. When I talk about multiple intelligences, I'll be wearing the hat of the scientist, of the scholar. I'll be telling you about what I think is the best way to think about human intellect, about human intelligence, and this is a scientific theory, and it's not without controversy, but it'll be either decided as valid or somewhat valid or not valid based upon scientific evidence in the next years. When I speak about the minds for the future, I'm really talking as a policymaker. I'm wearing the hat of a minister or of a superintendent of schools, somebody who has some power to decide what it is that we should be developing in our young people. And that is not a scientific question. That's a question of values, and it's not something that the scientists can decide. It's something that people who are in charge of policy can decide. So I hope you'll keep those 2 hats, those 2 professions in mind, and at the end I'm going to try to bring together the work on intelligence with the work on minds for the future. So, part 1 of the talk, the theory of multiple intelligences. In the field of psychology where I was trained, the study of intelligence is one of the oldest areas, and it's one about which a great deal of work has been done. And the work actually goes back to the beginning of the 20th century, over 100 years ago, at a time when many people were pouring into the capitals of Europe, into Paris and Berlin and London. And these were both people who lived in the provinces, farmers, and they were people who were coming from the colonies, from Africa or Asia or even the Americas. And some of those people were having difficulty in school. And so in Paris first, and then in other cities, people began to say, who can we predict will do well in school, and who can we predict will do poorly in school? And in particular, a psychologist named Binet was very empirical about it. He asked lots of children, lots of questions, and if all the children got the questions right, he threw them out. And if none of the kids got the questions right, he dismissed them. But if some students answered correctly and those students did better in school, and some students answered worse and didn't do well in school, he saved those questions and he used them as a measure of future school success. And then those became called tests of intelligence. And when they came to the United States, they were standardized so they could be given to many, many young people. And thanks to work both in Europe and the United States, the notion of IQ came up. And IQ is a single number. It's actually the ratio of your mental age to your chronological age multiplied by 100. So if you're a 10-year-old and you answer questions like a 12-year-old, then you have an IQ of 120, and that's good. If you're a 10-year-old and you answer questions like an 8-year-old, then you have an IQ of 80, and that's not so good. The IQ test was used not only to predict who would have problems in school, but also who would do very well. And often people who did very well in IQ tests would end up being administrators. They would go to the colonies, to Europe or Asia, to Africa or Asia or the Americas, the Pacific Islands, and they would handle the work that came in boxes, out boxes, and so on. And there's no question that this view of intelligence is very widely disseminated around the world, including in Thailand, I'm sure. And it's important to realize then it was only invented 100 years ago. People didn't have the notion of intelligence and intelligence tests before then. Now, as a student, both a young student and then when I became a student of psychology, I didn't have any particular reason to challenge this view of intelligence. It was one that I was comfortable with. I did perfectly fine in those tests, and of course that's one of the major reasons why people like the tests, if they do well in the tests. But I began to do research, and it was my fortune, my luck, to do research with two very different populations. I was working with individuals who had brain damage, individuals who were once okay but had a stroke or trauma or some other kind of injury to their cortex. And I was also working with children, kids who were average as well as kids who were gifted, but particularly interested in the arts and who was good in music or who was good in drawing or who was good in dance or who was good in literature. And I probably would never have come up with the theory of multiple intelligences if I hadn't been doing work both in neuropsychology, studying the effects of brain damage, and with children who have gifts or talents in various areas. But every day I would see patients who were perfectly fine in language but would get lost around the hospital or could find their way around the hospital but had no understanding of other people. And I would be running into young people who were brilliant poets but who couldn't solve a math problem, or kids who could draw very well but didn't do well in learning languages. And I realized that the notion of being smart, having high IQ, which implies you're good in everything, or being average, having an IQ of 100 and being average in everything, or having an IQ of 80 and being below average in everything, didn't make sense. It didn't comport with my own experience. You know, there's some people who are good in everything, there's some people who are poor in everything, but most people have rather jagged profiles. I myself am quite good with language and music and perfectly okay with logic, but I'm not very spatial at all. I'm not very good at using my body to solve problems. And if you'd met me 40 or 50 years ago, you would have said I'm not very understanding of other people. I think I've gotten better at that over time. So once you begin to think about people whom you know well, you realize that most people have a jagged profile of intelligences. So that was the intuition. Then in the late 1970s, so that's well over 30 years ago, I became involved in a big project, an empirical project, and my job was to rethink what we know about human intellectual potential on the basis of understanding the brain and understanding human development and understanding what's valued in different cultures and so on. And I had 5 years of support, which is very unusual, to do this very large study. And while I knew I was going to be writing about different mental abilities and mental capacities, sometime over 30 years ago, I decided to call these intelligences. And I developed a definition of intelligence and a set of criteria for what counts as an intelligence. For me, an intelligence is a biopsychological capacity reflecting our brain and our mind, to process information of different sorts, linguistic information, musical information, emotional information, and so on, and to use that processing to solve problems or to make things. So that's a definition. And it's very easy to suggest all kinds of intelligences. So I developed a set of 8 different criteria for what counts as an intelligence. And this is where the research came in. This is where the scholarship, what I would call the science, came in. I surveyed what we know about different cultures in the present era, but also historically and even prehistorically, what we know about human beings as they lived in the savannas of Africa 50,000 years ago and then migrated to Asia and Europe and eventually, probably via the Bering Straits to the Americas. I looked at what we know about how the human brain develops and how it's organized in people. There wasn't much known about genetics at that time, much more known now, but I also looked at what we know about what properties are inherited and how much they are inherited. I looked at the psychological literature ranging from experiments to tests to what we call transfer. Transfer is when you study one thing or learn one thing, does it make you better in something else? People love to say 100 years ago, if you studied Latin, it would make you better in math, but there was no particular evidence that it did. Nowadays, people love to say if you study music, it'll make you better in math, but again, there's no real evidence for that. So I looked at all these different sources of information, and eventually I came to the conclusion that human beings could be described as having a number of relatively independent intelligences. This means that you can be strong in one, average in a second, lousy in a third. The first 2 intelligences are the ones that we look at in IQ tests. Linguistic intelligence, people who are good with language, you might think about poets or writers or journalists, and logical mathematical intelligence. That's what we look for in scientists and computer experts, in finance people, accountants, and so on. If you're good in language and logic, you will do well in an IQ test. And as long as you stay in school, you'll think you're smart. And some of us never leave, so we never have a chance to challenge that we're smart. But most people do, and once you get out into the world, different kinds of environments, business environments, arts environments, risk-taking environments, understanding other people environments, teaching, clinical work, medicine, and so on, you realize that language and logic can only get you so far. Initially, I thought there were 7 intelligences. Now I think there are at least 8, and there may be 9 or 10. But I'm pretty strict. I don't just say, oh, there's a humor intelligence, oh, there's a sexual intelligence, oh, there's a food intelligence.